Thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon. My name is Erin Watley, Dr. Erin Watley. I teach in the Communication and Cinema department here. The work that I do on campus is related to culture and media. I teach a lot of culture and media classes here for the college. What I'm going to share with you today, though, is how I apply my culture and media training for work that I do outside the college. And so that's in the discussion of cultural sensitivity readings that I do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, what it looks like, what the need for it is. And then I'm going to give us some examples of what I've seen and feedback that I've given and what I think some of the takeaways are about this in terms of media, cultural trends, and ways to identify and also eliminate bias and stereotypes, especially as they show up in media. Full disclosure is that I'm going to be vague about my examples because I do sign some NDAs when I'm doing this work. So you'll see some examples. There's examples of published texts that I've worked with that are up here up front to give you an idea of the range of the applied areas that my work has been applied to. But what I'll show here up on the slides, I'll talk a little bit more in vague terms. We can talk more about details when the camera's turned off. All right. So as I said, Erin Watley, today we're talking about cultural sensitivity and how it is that I read and identify cultural bias in popular media texts, particularly print texts is what I have worked with the most. So I know that there is, in our culture at the moment, there's a lot of discussion and concern about what's being promoted via media and what's showing up in schools, and concern about ban this book, ban that book, for a variety of reasons. The work that I do is sort of related, but it deals more so with the more subtle and minute areas of cultural identity and representation that show up. So what happens is there are book publishers or different types of print publishers who have texts of different types, and they have authors who write them, editors who edit them for grammatical errors and continuity. But there's also, in the culture that we've had, there's also this growing need for another set of eyes to look at the way that culture is being represented, because there is still backlash, even for things that may be considered to be more subtle and minute, that identify, hey, you wrote this character with a huge bias, didn't you know that this is stereotypical representation, or the ways that you're talking about women in this really seems to miss the point. Come on in. Really seems to miss the point. And so what I do is I'm sort of a freelance editor who then is contracted to look at different texts in various stages of production to take a look particularly at racial representations and gender representations. The good part about how I've been prepared to do this work, though, is that I have a PhD in intercultural communication. So I look pretty broadly at the representations that are present in these texts. So I'm not just looking at race, I'm not just looking at gender or religion or class, but I really look at the ways that they intersect with one another, and I primarily prioritize identifying representations that might further marginalize or be offensive to marginalized groups. So I'm paying attention to, what are the minorities looking like in this particular story, or how are we overrepresenting the dominant groups and that sort of thing. And so there has been like I said, a growing demand for this. There have been some cases that have had some media attention, and this motivates publishers especially to have this check, right, to have their stuff vetted, if you will, by somebody who looks at these things in particular before they actually publish them, so that they don't have to do recalls or they're not issuing apologies, things of that nature. And so I provide that service, if you will. I've been doing this now for about 5 years, every now and then. So this screen is a little bit smaller than what I thought it was going to be. That's okay, and no problem. All I wanted to do is I want to take a few examples of what I've seen in different types of texts and talk about what are some of the issues that I identify there, and then the feedback that's been given, and some of the ways that they've been adjusted or corrected before that content has been published. I'll talk through a few, and I really do want to leave some time at the end for comments, questions, feedback about what this work is or the implications of this work, so I don't intend to talk the whole time. All right, I even have myself on a timer here so I don't ramble on and on and on and on. All right, so my first example here is from a children's chapter book. And this was a book that was focused specifically on representing women of color or young girls of color in the STEM fields. So it was a young girl who was interested in science, and that was her thing, right? And so in the story, what I ended up highlighting for you to see beforehand was that the character in this story is indexed clearly as being a young black girl, right? So there's passages in there that say, oh, she had box braids, or her grandmother came to school with a satin-lined cap on, right? So some things that show that this is a family of color that shows up in the initial draft that I had for this text. Now, the issue that I had with this particular text and the way that this family of color was written is that there were only indexes to make it clear that this is a black family, but there was no other context about what it means to be black at the time that this story was written. So it was clear that this is a black family, but then it came up in the story that this family was living in the Deep South in the 1990s, and they were one of a few people of color in this town. But there was no real address of what that would mean to experience that particular identity in that place and time in this film, or excuse me, not film, in this particular chapter book. So some of the feedback that I ended up giving to the publishers on this text was that cultural representation is more than vaguely indexing that the people here are people of color. That to ignore any other cultural context leaves the representation of this minoritized family feeling pretty flat, right? Like it doesn't mean anything else to be a person of color other than to have box braids and brown skin, right? Especially in this given point in time. And to identify particularly that, in the US American South, in the presumably, it's a realistic world, right? Not a world where racism never existed or where there is no legacy of Jim Crow or anything like that in the South, that none of that is directly mentioned in this particular text. So for a child reading this textbook, right, their understanding is seeing a young girl of color, yes, who is interested in science, yes, which is great, but there's nothing else about what her identity or what her family history, legacy would be that would really give it a fuller sense of a lived experience of a young black girl during this time. So I gave this feedback, and particularly in this example, I got some feedback back. They did another round of edits. And they said, hey, we've added some information, we've given a little bit more context, what do you think about it now? I read it again, and from my perspective, it still felt very surface. And that was the feedback that I gave to the publisher. That I noted again that the care and attention to these characters, the care and attention to these characters' blackness, particularly given the time and the setting of the story, it felt like it was just being sprinkled on top instead of being baked in. And I gave this feedback to the publishers. I also had some other notes about, hoping that they would also encourage more writers of color to write stories about children of color so that they can get that authenticity baked into the story. And so I sent that feedback back. The publisher then decided, in light of my feedback, to remove the character is no longer black in the published version of the story, okay? So basically they said, if we can't do this to the degree that satisfies, well, I don't know if I was the only reader, I'll say that. Sometimes publishers have multiple readers, so I don't know what feedback other readers gave. But the response after I actually, wait, let me not point at it. After I actually picked up the book, all right, was, oh, this character is a white girl. All right, now this character is not a little black girl. The same thing that I identified before with talking about her box braids, now it's just her hair. No mention of them being braided. And then also when it was talking about the grandmother coming to school with a satin-lined cap on, now the grandmother's hair is twisted around rollers and just coming into school otherwise, all right? So the character is no longer black as part of this response. I have mixed feelings about this, and like I said, we can talk more about this after I have some more examples that I've shared with you all. But in some ways, I do think that the representation given it annoyed me less. You know what I mean? Like, if you couldn't do this right, then I appreciate that you've making this particular adjustment instead of trying to, you know, sort of like half step the way through it. And hopefully in the future, they do take some of my recommendation. I'm not the only person saying this, having more people of color actually doing the writing and creating the stories so that stuff is automatic and somebody doesn't have to come through and say like, this is all you got, right? Like one little drop here, one little drop there. To me, that didn't feel authentic. And I admit that because I had read both versions of the story, I knew where the additions had been made and how it was still falling short. All right, so I'll give 2 more examples. My second example is from a text that was a history book written for young adults that focused specifically on the Second Amendment. And one thing that I'll highlight in terms of feedback that I gave for this was that originally when the author was talking about the organizing that was done after the Parkland shooting in Florida, right? Talking about the organizing that happened there, the role that the students took on. This paragraph says, Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg, and dozens of other students and parents formed the movement to ensure that the brutal shooting that occurred at Parkland would never happen again. Okay, and then goes on to talk about the organizing that's done with the Parkland, with those students who were the survivors of the Parkland shooting. Now, my concern with this, having had some additional cultural knowledge, right, sort of being plugged into the ways that things happen and the connections that individuals make about culture, was, hey, these Parkland students were not the first to organize in this fashion. And even the Parkland students themselves acknowledged that their organizing was modeled after organizing for nonviolence and anti-gun violence that was taking place in more urban areas from Black students. Particularly, there's a model that they were copying and working with organizers from Chicago. And this book didn't have any mention of that in there in addressing, you know, where this movement was really coming from. So part of the note and the feedback that I gave back was that the author doesn't acknowledge this connection, that these students built their organizing structure on work that had already been done and has long been done for years in urban communities and with young people who have organized against gun violence in their own communities. So I give some of that feedback here, and I give some, you know, oftentimes I'll give, you know, links to stories and background information so people know what I'm saying. I'm not just making it up. But that wasn't in there already. And also, I give the feedback when I'm talking to the publishers of what the impact is of what's there if it's not rectified and corrected. And so I just share this comment that I gave in talking about this discussion in this way and not naming the other students and the young Black students who were part of the organizing inspiration for Parkland, that there's a lot of whitewashing going on in that move, right? This is how that shows up. This is how it can become embedded into different texts by just omitting, right, the role and the participation that others had in the work that's being done. All right, so I gave that feedback. And also my favorite feedback to give, consistent for all of my texts, I am a strong advocate for writing Black with a capital B when you're talking about Black Americans. So I also gave this feedback in this text. I know it's not yet the full standard for writing styles across all of the different standardized writing forms, but there's a strong case to be made for it. Again, I won't get on that soapbox right now, but Black people are not just a color, they're a culture, and it's distinct, and so it should be capitalized. So I'm always giving that feedback as well, and that's what that quote is up in the corner over here. So what we then see in the final publication is a lot of this feedback was taken into advisement. There's a whole section that's added about the work that was done with students from Chicago and the alliance building that was added into the story. And also they capitalize all their blacks with capital B's, all right? So small victory for me throughout the entire text, which is what I highlighted over here. You can see those blacks are now capital B's and not just lowercase b's, all right? So that's another small victory, all right? Spreading capital B's throughout the literary world for blacks, all right, for Black people. And so that ended up in the final publication, okay? So another instance, right, where the feedback is important, this feedback is necessary in these areas, and another one where it was integrated in a way that gives some more diversity and a fuller sense of the history that is actually connected to these stories that are being told, okay? The last example that I will give is from a medical practitioner's textbook. And this is a textbook that caught some flack for having pretty stereotypical language when talking about different cultural competency type of responses and procedures that should be had. There were many examples of these missteps or these implicit biases that were placed throughout the text, but I'm just giving us one example that was in their nutrition section. And so in the nutrition section, there was this area that was, it was like one of those little text boxes that's separate from the whole text. And these were the culturally responsive boxes, right, that were in this textbook. And so here they're talking about selective variations in nutritional practices in different groups that are not white, right, is the way really that it's written. So, they have African American heritage, Arab heritage, Jewish heritage, Chinese, Mexican, Navajo. The way they selected the categories itself is a little bit problematic. I had comments about that. But the main thing here is that a lot of these designations are so generalized that they're not specific to those actual cultures. What they really do is perpetuate stereotypes about those cultures, and it's a little lazy, all right, if I'm being honest, right? So saying things like for Mexican heritage, that they like sweet drinks and including adding sugar to juice are popular. Who doesn't like a sweet drink, okay? Who doesn't have sugar in their soda or sugar in whatever it is that they're drinking oftentimes? This is not an exclusively, Mexican trait to promote in this particular way, right? And if we're talking, a similar thing happens in the African American section when it's talking about diets are often high in fat, cholesterol, and sodium, all right? Which again is, this is used a lot in discussions of Black food culturally in particular, but also this is a book from a Western context, all Western food is very high in sodium, cholesterol, and fats, right? So this is not exclusively an African American problem to address in this way. One more that I'll pull out for particulars is under Navajo Heritage here, they have rites of passage and ceremonies are celebrated with food. Does anybody else celebrate special occasions with food? I think there's going to be a pretty nice layout for Dr. Jaskin tomorrow, right? That a lot of people do that. So the ways that these were pulled out and identified in this way, all right, the feedback that I give here is that most of these comments are severely overgeneralized. And they are othered in such a way that the presumption is that these are not the practices of the norm, right? This is for the culturally more marginalized, whether it is religious, racial, or ethnic, but this is not the norm. When a lot of the things that they're identifying are actually the norm, especially in a Western cultural context. So, they're not unique, And what you have when that's in the textbook, and this textbook was actually recalled. I actually don't have the example because the textbook was expensive and they wouldn't give me one for free, all right? But I do know, I do know that changes were made pretty quickly after people started calling out that these were some issues, and adjustments were made to modify this language, taking out some of these heavily stereotyped discussions of others, right? They also had stereotypes about pain. They also had stereotypes in there just about like religious practices as it related to pregnancy, right? That were just very generalized, more so, didn't need to be drawn out in that particular way. So that's a few examples of the types of things that I've seen and the feedback that I have given. The last thing that I wanted to talk about briefly are just some of the lessons and the takeaways that I have from doing this kind of work. And really it is that messages that are biased are oftentimes very subtle, all right? Or at least that's a part of the work that I do as somebody who pays attention to pop culture and media. It is one thing to talk about big racism, right? Like, people talking about, I hate somebody because of their color, but mostly what we see and what maintains some of the stereotypes that exist in the world are subtle everyday things that oftentimes just sort of slide under the radar, or it's just sort of like an offhand sort of thing. But as much as those are cultural sometimes in practice, they're very much codified in media, which is a huge distributor of culture and understanding of people, especially people who are not you, right? The main way that we learn about others, if we don't have a direct connection to them in our personal lives, is through popular media, okay? And so these sorts of stereotypes showing up in these particular types of texts maintain that, right? So that maintenance is subtle and it is present in media. I have yet to review a text where I said, I have 0 comments, right? 0 things to share. Some are better than others. Some have put more care and into their representations of different groups and talking about them. And some are horrible. Some are really like, we really missed the mark here. I don't understand how this made it through even an editor before it was sent to me, because it's just stereotype after stereotype after stereotype. Most of the ones that I think are in that category, I have not seen go to print yet. So maybe that's a good thing. But the point is that well-meaning individuals still perpetuate stereotypes. Whether or not the author is a person of color or not, whether or not it's a woman writing about women's stories or not, there can still be stereotypes that are present there, and especially what is present are stereotypes or biases along other cultural intersections that maybe are not of the author or the editor. And so those can be seen, and they are present oftentimes in subtle ways. So I do think that having reviewers who sort of do the work that I do in some sort of form should be more normalized. It also should be valued more. It's still a little bit fringy, if you will, but I do think that it should be valued and should become a part of the standard. Now, the controversy is, though, I don't want this job of doing sensitivity readings to fill in the gap of people actually hiring individuals to create more diverse stories, right? There is a frustration among some people who do this type of work saying, well, you think because I said that this was culturally sensitive by my standard, that now you have a pass, right? Well, somebody signed off on it, and that means I couldn't have had anything in here that's offensive because we had somebody look at it. That's not the case. And also that shouldn't mean, oh, we have these reviewers, now we don't have to worry about hiring more diverse editors or writers or types of stories because we've got it covered with this, this fill in the gap type position of looking at it. So it shouldn't be that, but I do think that within media industries in general, there should be more attention to people, or calling people in who have the experience and the scope to look across different types of identities and cultures to say, hey, you might have a problem here, or you might want to think about this representation a little bit, or you might want to add something that balances out this narrative that you're representing about these other groups. So that's part of what I think should be important. And then also, when I talk about this, when I think about how this bias ends up still being a part of the media that's being created in our modern day diverse society, the one thing that I have to offer that I do that I think helps to prepare me for doing these types of readings, which I think could be advantageous for anybody else who is a media creator, is to consume more widely and diversify your own consumption, right? Yes, I do have a PhD in intercultural communication and media analysis, but a lot of what I read and what I notice comes from me just paying attention to other stories, right? Stories that are going on, right? I remember hearing about the Parkland students talking about how they had worked with students organizing in Chicago, and then I was like, oh, this is missing, right? That didn't come directly from my my formal educational experience. It's just because I was listening, right? I was listening to the story that was beneath like the main story, right? Like what else was going on there. And so I think that for individuals who are media content creators, to be even better about that, wherever you're at, to do more of that, more listening and more incorporating and just paying attention to the other stories that are going on, that would be beneficial for avoiding having these biases being a part of the texts that are being created. And yeah, I think that's it. Where am I at time? Oh, I did pretty good, 25 minutes. All right, so we've got a little bit of time here, which is great. Questions, comments, concerns, feedback, anything like that, I'd love to field it, or doesn't have to be directly related, but wherever you're at. Yes?
I just want to know, are you able to just read and enjoy the read, or are you always like thinking,
You mean when I read on my own, or when I read something I've been hired to read?
Like, are you culturally sensitive eyes still? Like, can you enjoy the read?
I can enjoy the read, but I can only turn that side of my brain down. I can't turn it off. So there are things that I'll read or like I'll consume, and I was like, I'll use a non-book example because I've gotten more into listening to books than reading books because so much of my reading is work-related. It's just become really difficult for me. But I do watch, I watch a lot of TV, I teach pop culture, I consume a lot of media already. So I watch trash TV. Like, I love 90 Day Fiance, all right? Anybody want to, I love them all right? Before the days, during the days, okay, the other way, I like the 90 Day Fiance franchise. I know that it's problematic on a lot of fronts as it relates to culture specifically. I can enjoy the absurdity of it, but I'm always in the back of my head processing like, oh, here's a cultural trope. Here's why this show is so successful, because it tells a really familiar narrative about others and about love and the gender dynamics and the racial dynamics. I'm aware of them, but I can still enjoy, all right? And I also have to be aware of who wants to hear that, right? So sometimes family members will be like, not right now, right? And I'll be like, well, actually, so I have to turn it down. It's not all the way off, but I do have to turn it down. And I think I teach media literacy here too. Part of being able to critique media is also figuring out that we live in a society where media is very present and pervasive, and figuring out ways to still enjoy it. I don't want anybody to say, like, I can't ever find a way to enjoy media because there's a lot of positive that goes along with it. But I just encourage, have both. Have the positive, but then also say, here's some negative. I love Marvel, but let's talk about, the problematic imperialist, nature of a lot of the stories. Let's do them both, right? Let's do them both. That's my plea, if you will. All right, I saw your hand go.
I was gonna say, if you're trying to make like a representative work of maybe a culture that you don't personally identify with, how can you kind of balance like having an accurate representation of that group and also not like creating like stereotypes?
That's a good question. And I got asked that question a lot. The question was about if you are creating a story or some sort of content that has a different culture, how do you recreate it without being stereotypical? And yeah, being stereotypical. My best advice for that is to talk with individuals who are a part of the culture that you're representing that's not your own, right? Have them take a look at it if they're willing, right? Don't just run up to somebody and be like, hey, you're Black, can you take a look at my Black character, right? But I have had students, come to me and say, hey, Dr. Watley, I'm working on this thing. It has Black women in it. Can we talk about the representation? I'll be like, sure, I'll talk to you about it. I'm not of the school of thought that I don't think that anybody can tell any story or have characters that are not wholly themselves. I do not take that particular strain of thought, but I do think that you need to be careful and conscious of how you could replicate a dynamic that you're not even aware of if you're not thinking about it, right? So I just ask people to not be, what's the word? Overconfident, right? Like, oh, I can just do it, right? Like, I have a Black friend. Like, I know what to put in there. Have some checks, right? Have some checks and be curious and be open to the feedback that you would get from there. And it's a conversation because no one person is going to be a monolith for that whole group, right? Just because I say it's okay and then you talk to somebody else and they say, well, actually this offended me on this level, you need to still consider their opinion, right? Because I even have things that I miss sometimes. There's things that I don't read for as well as others. So you've got to be open to the process of learning and adjusting as you work with others. Thanks for the question. Good one. Yes?
So, how do you feel about, have you read the Harry Potter books?
I haven't, but I'm aware of them. There's a lot of pop culture that I know enough about it, but I maybe haven't gotten all the way into it. So I know Harry Potter.
So, how do you feel about J.K. Rowling's, well, for one, she wrote a book filled with straight white people, which I'm okay with.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, but then, basically she's trying to go back and say, oh, I always thought this character was gay, and I always pictured this character being Black, even though she never even implied those things. How do you feel about those types of people?
I wouldn't overgeneralize to those types of people, but I can speak to that particular example. I don't know J.K. Rowling, but I would say if that's what she wants to say to sort of backtrack, okay, I guess she can say it. But I think that the consumer can also have commentary about, hey, but then how did we get all the way to here and this was never brought up before? Right? There's also other areas where J.K. Rowling has gotten a lot of criticism as it relates to Native mysticism, also comments on LGBTQ community, particularly trans women. And so considering that those are also a part of her story is important. If that's what she says she thought in her imagination and then something else went onto the silver screen, okay. That happens a lot too, right? But if it isn't consistent also with other ways that that story has tracked, it feels a little bit revisionist. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. Yes.
Yeah, sort of taking that idea another kind of step further. My question revolves largely around responsible consumerism.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be the kind of strategies or resources even that you would recommend for people to become more responsible consumers? So taking Harry Potter as another example, one of the primary characters who is Black and written as Black in the book is named Kingsley Shacklebolt.
Mm-hmm.
There is an Irish character who consistently blows things up. These are things that in retrospect seem very, aggressively, indexed, as you said.
Yeah.
But a whole generation of people were not educated to see those kind of things. So what are the resources and what are the kind of practices that you would suggest even in education that might help with that kind of media literacy?
That's a really good question. I would start with taking in the phrase, all your faves are problematic, right? Which just means that even the things that are your favorite can still have problematic elements to them. That's the fact of life, that's human nature. Whatever it is, there is really nothing that's gonna be 100% perfect along all those areas, okay? On the other hand, in terms of recommendations that I would have, particularly for consumers, my biggest thing right now, and there is a shift in availability, if not exposure, of stories that are being told by the people who have those lived experiences. So that's my first turn, right? If you want to know more about the Black experience, read a lot of Black authors who are talking about the Black experience. They're not all going to be the same, but it's going to give you a greater sense of variety in that type of storytelling and experience. This is true for television and films, right? I oftentimes point people in the direction of, hey, yeah, it's great to talk about the experiences of Native and Indigenous people. There's stories that have been told about them, written about them, great. But right now, we're definitely in an era where there are more mainstream content and content producers that are telling stories of Native people in their own voice. So I say go to the source, right? Go and hear from the source about the complexities of their experience, about the nuance of intergroup conflicts, if you will. Learn from them, right? And rely less on storytelling from maybe other big mainstream outlets that maybe don't have as much input from the individuals that come up as, bit characters or, on the side characters or whatever, maybe have a couple of good ones, but go where it's rich, right? Go where the representation is rich, and that's going to come mostly from the people who have lived it and have a part of it. And like I said, you won't get everything from it. Your favorite Black author, right, could have issues with gender or queer identity or religion, right? Your favorite author that's talking about queer topics might have some issues with race, right? It's never gonna be 100%, but if you go and hear from more of those individuals who are telling their own experiences, you will be set up better. Yes?
What is your opinion in regards to tribalism and pandering in connection to racism using the medical practitioner's textbook you used?
Could you say more about what you mean by tribalism and pandering?
For example, in America you have racism, but they don't talk about tribalism,
Yeah.
right? But then certain authors tend to not know that they are being racist, but they are trying to pander to a certain demographic. So how can you tell them that, hey, what you're doing is in this context? Because outside the first world, or let me say the first world countries observe racism. Second and third world countries observe tribalism. So in regards to, I'll give an example, the former President Trump, when he said Mexicans are rapists and criminals, when he said that, the Mexican flag at the border was no longer carried by the immigrants. You could see flags from Honduras, El Salvador, and all that, because those are third world countries who see tribalism. And they see themselves as tribes. Like, I'm a tribe from El Salvador, you're a tribe from Mexico.
I got you.
So,
I got you.
yes.
Okay. I mean, the one thing I would say to that is even in my feedback, I do try to give explanations that also talk about the audience, right? So think about the audience that's going to be consuming this, even if it's not your whole audience, right? I oftentimes will make feedback like, hey, Black people reading this are likely to be very triggered by your representation in this way, right? Even if you didn't write it for them or with them in mind in particular, that would be the case. I think the same thing could relate when you're talking about tribalism or any division along different lines. The story and the feedback that I give is very similar, right? It's just applied differently. So, thinking about the different groups that they would be talking to is really important for the message. Now, big picture, right? I would say we shouldn't be denigrating anybody, right? Why is that the way of talking about others? That's a different practice, than just talking about race or gender or class or something like that. Thinking about like how we use words and how we describe people and why we make the descriptions that we make. That's a lot more internal work and like more deep cultural work. But I can have that conversation too. But that's what I would say to that. Thank you. Yes.
Would you say like through your work and what you've been doing, like, do you say like the genre of the works you've read has affect bias? Like in terms of, for example, like romance, like contracts and descriptions are like hyped up anyway,
Mm-hmm.
instill that passion, but it can also get stereotypical pretty quick in terms
Yeah.
of like sync and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So would you say like reading different things, like you have to analyze, is this just the genre or is this like hyped bias it's in that?
Yeah, I do. I do have to think about, I don't want to read something that is like a comedy and be like, this joke isn't funny. You know what I mean? Or like, you've done too much. You've now gone over the top. I really do have to think about the context of the whole document that I'm looking at. And that's why sometimes people will say, hey, can I just send you this chapter? And I'm like, no, I need the whole book. You know what I mean? Like, even if this character only shows up in this one chapter, I need to understand, like, how are they talking about this character? Where does it show up elsewhere? So I really do try to consider the context of what's being created. Like, if it's a history book, okay, we're gonna get a lot of details and a lot of background, okay. I'm not going to edit that down, but I'm going to say, hey, in the way that you are already talking about these individuals, when you talk about these other individuals, it looks different, right? I had a historical narrative that talked about white people and indigenous people, and I was like, hey, you are consistently talking about the indigenous people as being more violent, more aggressive than the white people, but then at the end, you talk about how the white people wiped everybody out, right? Who was more vicious, who was more violent in the end? I was like, your language, and I pull out examples of like, look how you use this language, look how you use this language in the context of that story. So I do have to be pretty context specific. And it makes it fun for me too, because I'm not just reading one type of thing, sometimes it's a baby book, sometimes it's a kid's novel, sometimes it's a treatment for a graphic novel or something like that. So I get to read across genres, which also keeps things interesting for me. So thank you, really good question. Yes, in the back.
Do you think that when people like write stories to like speak for themselves, I think like when Black people write stories and like when I'm like queer people that like write stories, do you think that there's like an implicit bias to like, I guess as you were saying earlier, to like pander to like their own culture? Do you think it's to other cultures? Like how does that?
I don't think anything is without bias. So is there a bias in whatever somebody's writing from their perspective? Yeah, it's their personal bias. They're telling their story from their lens. It's for the person who is reading that to understand that I'm hearing a perspective, not just the entire, objective truth about what the Black experience is, right? That's for the person who's taking it in. And so to remember that, when you're looking at anything, when you're looking at a history book, when you're looking at, a novel, like this is written from a particular voice, how do I then understand that in the broader world? So yes, I would say there are biases, and sometimes everybody doesn't have to speak to everything, right? You don't have to tell a story about all the different things that happen around you. If you just want to talk about your personal experience, great. I'd like to just say this is your experience, right? Don't say this is the experience of everybody. And then also for the reader to think about, hey, this is written from a particular voice. Who else is saying something like this, but a little bit different? Can I go find them? Let me see what they have to say, right? It's continuing to deepen your exposure, part of that. Thank you for that. Yes?
So my question is kind of similar to the one that you were talking about like consumerism, but kind of on the flip side of that, like, how do content creators kind of have to grapple with the fact that like they're not going to be perfect no matter how much they try to be? Like, I guess is the question.
We're human, we mess up, and be quick to apologize and sincerely apologize if mistakes are made. I've seen no examples where somebody's defensiveness has made the situation look any better, right? So saying like, well, I didn't mean to. Well, this is what I was trying to convey. Well, I thought, well, I talked to this other person. That doesn't undo the fact that you missed something or it's being read by a different community in a way that they say causes harm. So then you apologize for that harm, right? And then look for how you might adjust to do this better. And also talk with the people who say they've experienced the harm to talk about strategizing what could be done better, right? Does this need a correction? Does this need a different voice? Can I just promote somebody who's doing this work instead of creating it for myself, right? For my own platform? How can collaboration take place in order for you to eliminate bias? It doesn't just have to be you, right? You can open it up and hope that the person is gracious to an apology. And if they're not, that's their prerogative, right? But you can start from that. Like, I will make mistakes. And leave it at that. Thank you. Yes?
So sort of on, sort of hooking into that question, one of the things I think that we all see a lot these days when we are having these conversations, which people can be very sensitive to and can get defensive about, is there tends to be, or there can tend to be, not necessarily virtue signaling,
Mhm.
but that purity and perfection ideal.
Yeah.
So I think a really big question is, how do you, in conversations about text or in recommendation of text, negotiate that, the complexity of being human and the fact that your characters are human, and
Mhm.
they're not supposed to be perfect characters
Mhm.
that are perfectly representative.
Mhm.
That's just not how people are.
Mhm.
So how do you have productive conversations that still allow people to have enjoyment in literature, when that, I think, is something that we as a culture are really navigating right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that one way I navigated with my feedback is just what I was talking about in terms of giving feedback in context, right? Like, you don't need to make this black girl the perfect black girl, right? But I need you to pay attention to the way that you're representing her in connection with the other characters of this story or what's going on around this story. And like I said, sometimes things do feel like virtue signaling, and sometimes that's subjective. And sometimes it's a matter of what's the big story here. And I also have to have a level of restraint where I know I can't, A, they don't pay me enough, and B, it's not my responsibility to go in and rework an entire novel. You know what I mean? So I can say, hey, here are the issues. Here are some suggestions of maybe what a change would look like. But the implications of not having that change are this, right? It looks like you're whitewashing or you're overgeneralizing. You know, you keep punishing the black woman character, but the other characters don't receive the same punishment. Or your black woman character is the least developed character in this story. Even though she's imperfect, everybody else in the story is imperfect. How come everybody else gets an arc where they get to tragedy, triumph, and then resolution? I know that's not the right story arc characteristic. Sorry, literature people. All right, but make it through those stages, right? But the young black girl only gets to tragedy and doesn't have the resolution, right? Because then she's not in the story anymore, right? And so I give that kind of feedback, not in adjusting the essence of the character. This is what I try to do, not the essence of the character, but like, this is what your story seems to be doing with these other characters or the story overall, right? This is a baby book to celebrate, feminism, if you will. Here's an instance where this baby is doing something that's counter maybe to the ideas of feminism, right? But not this baby is ugly or like, how come the baby, not those sorts of things. But I try to look at it in the context of that. But I think that is also useful for when we think about that exchange in our own lives, of thinking about the context and commenting on what this looks like in the context of our perception, right? Like, it seems to me that given the history of this company or given the history of this institution, that you have done a lot of, uplifting for some groups and resources for some groups, but we haven't got a lot of resources for these others, right? And so while you giving some to the groups maybe who have been marginalized is a little bit, how come we can't raise it up to the level of what we've seen for these other groups so that it's not just virtue signaling? Like, oh, somebody called us out, now we're gonna do a little bit. It's like, no, do a lot of it so it's as ingrained as it is for the other examples of culture that I see elsewhere. I know that's very like vague-ish in, okay. But I mean, the application could look differently, but that's the heart of what I would wanna promote.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
You talked about earlier how like the students from Chicago were helping the students from Parkland, and you kind of had to dig deeper to find articles about that. What are like good media sources to find deeper articles?
That is a good question. I don't want to promote just one type of media, right? But here's the thing that I will encourage. Like, there are things, there are nonpartisan, like, media bias charts and groups, right, that can talk to you about, or that can show you sort of like information that is not as biased or has more depth to it. Now, there's still bias that shows up in AP Press and Reuters and like, you know, those ones that are said to be like the most objective because they give you a lot of the surface, but not a lot of the underpinning story. I would say, look for long reads. Is honestly the feedback that I give to a lot of my students, right? Instead of like who to follow and like scroll through quick stories, look for long, deep stories. And there are some outlets like news magazines that give you in-depth stories that can cover some more of the complexities of it other than the who, what, when, why, where, how, and will give you some more perspective. And then after you've read one long one, read maybe one more, right? Not just a particular news outlet. And if you want some suggestions of like maybe particular places, this is biased because I am biased as well. My favorite news magazine is The Atlantic. They have really good long reads and in-depth. Like I said, it's not everything. I have critiques often of their culture section, but they do give a lot of context for the way that they cover stories, and they wait a little bit sometimes when they're promoting them. They're not the only one, but that's one of my favorites.
And if you're lost, come see your librarian.
Oh yes, and if you're lost, come see your librarian, absolutely. I know. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
You mentioned graphic novels. Do you ever look at the photos or the illustrations and the cover art to like see the stereotypes?
Yeah. I have recently been reading a comic book character, and in doing those, I ask for the artwork along with the writing because I want to know if you're using graphics. I want to know how those are showing up with others, and you know, sometimes yes is the short answer to your question. And sometimes things do pop up. You know, I had one where I was like, why does the mom here look like a monster? You know, and the other ones, yeah, they have exaggerated cartoon features, but they don't look as monstrous, right? So can we soften her features a little bit to look like she looks on the other pages, right? Like, I'll make comments like that. Or sometimes, you know, one I read recently was a children's picture book, but, you know, they showed a young black character, a young black man, like he was meeting a father figure, and the father, in the picture in the comic was, the boy stood up and the father was like, how about I punch you in the face? And I was like, whoa, hold on. You know, like, here's an image of a young black kid in a hoodie, and the first thing the father says to him is, I want to punch you in the face. And you see the visual of like the father's down here and the kid is up here. I'm like, it was related to a cartoon. So I also got to watch the cartoon. In the context of the cartoon, it made sense. But when they put it in the book, they took out some of the context that made his commentary more understandable. Again, I didn't want to correct or change the character, but I was like, hey, to have this and the immediate punching, I need some more context, or I need you to change the visuals and the picture so that we're not getting that image, which is very familiar, of a young black male being perceived as a threat immediately. So yeah, that is a part of the story. Thanks. Did you have a question?
I was curious about the books that you brought along with you.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about them a little bit.
Sure. I won't talk about them in too much detail because I've signed NDAs. But I will say that this is a variety of the books, the types of books that I've been able to evaluate over the past few years. And so it's a range, like I said, of things like baby books to regular adult novels to bio books to history books or short children's chapter books about famous figures. And so it really is a variety of ways that I'm able to apply my cultural knowledge, or like, you know, how I want to see underrepresented characters represented in media. I get to look at and read for those in a wide range of texts based on people who have approached me to do this kind of work. And I didn't set out to just do one kind of reading. I kind of actually fell into this work by happenstance. And I've just had different types of publishers who have come and asked me to do readings for them. So I've ended up with a pretty wide variety of texts that I've gotten to look at. Thanks. Yes?
So, thinking of continued education texts, especially in like the medical field or in the criminal justice domain, what is a good way to push back over like the rushed through portions? Because there's so many old ideals that are still being pushed that have these, you know, horrible contexts that can't be eradicated yet, but they're being so quickly overlooked, especially like, you know, here's a pamphlet on it. You know, what is a good way to start trying to make impactful, shorter texts that are moving in the right direction if you don't have the time or the space to push for the proper tools?
Do you mean on the part of like somebody who's a creator, like who's a writer?
Yes, or someone who's even trying to influence curriculum design. Part of that, I think, is it is really hard, like I said, to get something like a textbook changed, right? I don't know from the writing perspective because I don't have a lot of experience actually doing the publishing myself. But as a teacher, I would say that a big part of that is for the teacher to have a better grounding of what to look for and what not, and for them to be consistent about filling in the gaps. For them to say, I have textbooks where I've taken the textbook and I'm like, hey, this is what we're learning. But also, did you notice that in this textbook, in the international section, all we're talking about is Europe and South America, and we're not talking about the movie industry in Africa or Nigeria, for example? You know, how come that's not brought up, right? So because I have some of that content or that context and that knowledge, I say, hey, yes, we're using this textbook, but look at how also this textbook has missed out on some of the representations of other groups. So that's become part of what I try to do as an educator myself. And then also again, from an educator's perspective, I will find texts that are written by the people who I think have not gotten as much representation, and I'll bring them to the students, right? So they might be shorter, they might be videos, they might be TikToks, they might be memes, you know, like I'm big in the pop culture space, so I like to use that kind of stuff. And I bring those intentionally from like, hey, we're talking about Black women, but we haven't really heard from Black women. Here is what some Black women are saying about this particular instance or experience, okay? So listen to them, and then how does that compare with what you've heard that's more mainstream and represents more of the dominant culture?
So going off of the hope that this work becomes more standard across the kind of media industry, what would be your recommendation for people who might be interested in pursuing this kind of work, and how would you recommend kind of some hopeful shifts in those industries to be investing in these more people who are hopefully going to want to do this kind of reading?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, like I said, I kind of fell into it. There are some databases that people are part of that publishers go to get people who do sensitivity readings specifically. I also say for those people who are going to be content creators, or you end up in a place where you have some power and position for vetting content at whatever level or stage, remember, that you need other eyes, right? Remember that you can look for other individuals and pull them into that area, because like I said, my hope is that it's not just a freelance one-time thing, but there are people like on staff, or there are individuals who are part of that particular industry or corporation who do that work until you have more representation in the room just sort of all the time. So it's not strictly a marginalized, like, oh, hey, just bring the person of color in to like look at all the person of color stuff, and they're not integrated, right? Ultimately, my answer to everything is full integration. But until we get there, then people being aware of and serious about pulling people in who can do this work and paying them what you pay other editors in order to do that kind of work as well. So I advocate that and ask people to remember that. I know we're at time, or just about, so, we are exactly at time, all right? So thank you all for joining me. If you have questions, comments, concerns, otherwise, I'll be around. If you need my email address, I have some cards or whatever. But thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, have a good rest of the day, guys. Thank you.